The morning of February 19, 1945, dawned grey and oppressive on the small, wind-swept island of Iwo Jima. The Pacific theatre was at its boiling point, with the Allies poised for a final push against Japan's fortified strongholds. As American landing crafts hit the black sand shores, the stench of salt water and oil mixed with the acrid scent of gunpowder, a harbinger of the brutal conflict that awaited. Overhead, fighter planes screamed across the sky, their engines deafening as they roared in a coordinated strike against the island's defenders. On the ground, thousands of Marines poured onto the beaches, their boots sinking in the soft sand as they scrambled toward the heavy Japanese fortifications that dotted the island. But Iwo Jima's volcanic crags and rugged terrain held more than just beaches and cliffs. Beneath the surface, an entire underground network of bunkers, tunnels, and caves sprawled like a twisted labyrinth. The Japanese had spent months fortifying the island with meticulous precision, creating an impenetrable defense system designed to withstand any assault. Their intent was clear: make the Americans pay a terrible price for every inch of ground. What the Japanese defenders did not anticipate, however, was the arrival of a weapon that would turn their seemingly impregnable bunkers into mere death traps. As the Marines advanced, they encountered resistance, unlike anything they had experienced before. The enemy was dug in deep, concealed within the earth, firing from concealed positions that made direct combat nearly impossible. The Japanese soldiers were tucked away in their bunkers, safe from artillery and rifle fire. But the Allies had something that the Japanese could not prepare for: flamethrowers. The first wave of Marines, armed with this terrifying weapon, began their advance toward the enemy positions, the air thick with the acrid scent of gasoline and the crackle of flamethrower jets. For the soldiers entrenched inside the bunkers, the sight was something they had never imagined: a wall of fire surging toward them with the fury of a vengeful god. The flamethrower, a relatively new weapon at the time, was simple yet devastating. Fuel was contained in a pressurized tank, mounted on the back of the operator, with a hose connected to a nozzle that could project a jet of flames up to 50 feet. The American Marines had learned quickly that their success on the Pacific Islands would not come through conventional firepower alone, but with weapons like the flamethrower, they could neutralize entrenched positions with terrifying effectiveness. As the first few bursts of fire lit up the dense vegetation and the Japanese bunkers, the defenders inside reacted in disbelief. The air was soon filled with the screams of soldiers trapped inside their bunkers as the flames ignited everything in their path. The heat was unbearable, and within moments the fortified underground shelters were burning from the inside out. Japanese soldiers who had once believed their positions to be safe found themselves consumed by the very structures they had spent months building. The weight of their shock was almost tangible. How could these invaders penetrate their sanctuaries with such ease? How could they have foreseen this hellish weapon that turned their bunkers into ovens? The Japanese soldiers who managed to escape the flames were disoriented and terrified. Many of them rushed into the open, where they were met with rifle fire from the advancing American forces. Those who remained inside their bunkers were often suffocated by the thick smoke or burned alive in the ensuing inferno. The devastation was immediate and overwhelming. What had once seemed like an impenetrable defense network was now little more than a smoldering ruin, the flames licking the sky like a signal of doom. The psychological impact on the Japanese defenders was profound. To them, Iwo Jima had been their last line of defense, a place where they would make their stand and die in glory for the emperor. But now they were forced to confront the realization that no matter how deep they dug, no matter how many reinforcements they received, they could not escape the fire. The flamethrower, with its unforgiving reach, had shattered their sense of security, turning their once unassailable positions into graves. For the American Marines, the flamethrower was a weapon of psychological warfare, as much as it was a tool of destruction. The sight of fire pouring into the enemy's strongholds shattered any remaining illusions of invincibility that the Japanese soldiers may have had. It was not just the destruction of enemy positions that was significant, but the demoralizing effect it had on the Japanese defenders. Those who had witnessed the flamethrowers in action saw firsthand that no matter how deep they dug, no matter how reinforced their bunkers were, there was no place to hide from the flames. As the battle progressed, The flamethrowers would prove invaluable in clearing the island of its entrenched defenders. Each bunker taken out by fire was a blow to the Japanese resolve, a physical and psychological defeat that reverberated through the ranks. The flamethrowers had made clear that the defenders of Iwo Jima, for all their preparation and discipline, were now at the mercy of a new kind of warfare, one that knew no boundaries, no safe havens. The battle for Iwo Jima raged on for over a month, but the use of flamethrowers was crucial in turning the tide. By the time the Marines had secured the island, they had effectively destroyed the Japanese defensive infrastructure. The psychological toll was immense. Many of the surviving Japanese soldiers had been shattered by the relentless onslaught of flame and fire. They had been forced to confront the brutal reality that their defenses were no match for the sheer power of the American offensive. It is difficult to overstate the horror that the flamethrowers inflicted on the Japanese soldiers. While the weapon itself was simple, its effect on both the battlefield and the psyche of the soldiers was profound. It was a reminder that warfare had entered a new era, one in which the line between man and machine, between survival and annihilation, had blurred into a fiery abyss. The Japanese soldiers, once so confident in their ability to hold Iwo Jima, were now witnesses to a weapon that could wipe away their defenses in moments, leaving nothing but a smoldering ruin in its wake. The use of flamethrowers on Iwo Jima marked a new chapter in the Pacific War, one where the technology and innovation of the Allies played a decisive role in shifting the balance of power. For the soldiers who faced them, the terror of fire was an indelible memory, a reminder of just how vulnerable they had been, even in the deepest, most fortified corners of their bunkers. And for the Marines who wielded these weapons, it was a terrifying but necessary tool that helped them conquer an enemy that had seemed invincible just days before. In the end, Iwo Jima would become a symbol of both sacrifice and technological evolution. The American forces had not just defeated an enemy on the battlefield, they had forced them to confront the future of warfare, a future that would burn through every defense, no matter how entrenched, with the fury of an unstoppable flame. As the dust settled on Iwo Jima and the Marines began their arduous task of securing the island, the full scale of the devastation caused by the flamethrowers began to emerge. The Japanese soldiers, their morale shattered and their defensive lines obliterated, were now in a desperate fight for survival. But it wasn't just the tactical implications of the flamethrower that would resonate through the war. It was the deeper psychological impact that reverberated across the Pacific and beyond. The fear that the flamethrowers instilled in the enemy was profound. The Japanese soldiers, who had been taught to fear death in combat but also to embrace it as an honor, now found themselves facing a new kind of terror. The flamethrower was not just a weapon of destruction. It was a weapon that annihilated all notions of a soldier's dignity. No longer could they hide in trenches or bunkers, assured of a swift and honorable death. The fire swept through their defenses, consuming everything in its path, leaving them helpless, exposed, and often in a slow, agonizing death that stripped them of their identity as warriors. It wasn't just a physical threat, but a psychological, one that shattered their will to fight. The psychological warfare was perhaps even more significant than the physical destruction wrought by the flamethrowers. To the Japanese defenders, their fortified positions had always symbolized safety, an unbreakable barrier between them and the enemy. But the flamethrowers stripped that illusion away. The once feared bunkers and tunnels were no longer safe havens. The very ground they had fought so hard to protect had become an inferno, rendering their best efforts futile. It was the ultimate humiliation for the Japanese soldier, whose honor and survival had always been tied to his ability to hold ground. But now, no matter how deep or strong the fortress, the flames would find them. One Japanese soldier, in an intercepted letter, described his fear upon hearing the telltale roar of an approaching flamethrower. "I had heard the rumors, but nothing could prepare me. The fire, like a monster, a beast that knew no mercy, came pouring from the dark. There was no escape, no place to hide." His words spoke not just to the physical terror of the weapon, but to the deep psychological disintegration it caused. He wasn't just afraid of the flames, he was afraid of the very idea of defeat, something far worse than death. The American soldiers, while emboldened by the success of their flamethrowers, were not without their own psychological challenges. As the weapon's full destructive power became clear, even the Marines who used the flamethrowers couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had unleashed. The sight of men burning alive, screaming as the fire consumed their bodies, had a deep emotional toll. Despite their resolve to carry out their mission, the brutality of it often left them questioning the moral cost of such devastating weaponry. Private Charles Murphy, who operated a flamethrower during the battle, later recalled the experience. When the fire hit them, it was like watching a whole new kind of war. It was different from anything I had ever seen. I could hear them screaming, and you knew there was no way they were going to get out. It's something I'll never forget. Though the flames were effective, they came at a heavy emotional price for the operators. In the heat of battle, with the noise of explosions and gunfire all around them, the flames' fiery breath seemed like the ultimate equalizer. But in the aftermath, the sight of the charred bodies and the knowledge that many had suffered slow, agonizing deaths lingered with the men who had wielded the weapon. The psychological toll of the flamethrower also reverberated across the broader war effort. Iwo Jima, though just one battle, marked a shift in how both the Allies and the Axis perceived the future of warfare. As the conflict shifted toward Okinawa and the home islands of Japan, the psychological impact of flamethrowers and similar technologies was clear. No longer would wars be fought on the grand stage of open battlefields or in the trenches of Europe. The nature of conflict had changed. War would now be fought in close quarters, in cities, jungles, and subterranean fortifications, with brutal efficiency and an unforgiving willingness to use weapons that targeted not just the enemy's soldiers, but their very spirit. The impact on the Japanese command was also significant. The use of flamethrowers and similar incendiary weapons was a game-changer. Japanese forces, who had long relied on their defense strategies, strengthened by their tenacity and discipline, were now forced to face the reality that their ability to hold ground was no longer a given. They had been defeated by an enemy that was willing to go further than they could have anticipated. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Their pride, their honor, and their decades-old tactics had been rendered useless by a force of technology and willpower that none of them had predicted. In the wake of the battle, the Japanese military began to rethink their own strategies. They could no longer depend solely on their deep bunkers and hidden tunnels, nor could they expect to simply outlast the Allied forces. The US military had proven that it could bring the full weight of its technological advances to bear in ways that were simply overwhelming. As a result, the Japanese military shifted its focus toward developing new forms of defensive warfare, techniques that would incorporate more advanced camouflage, further underground fortifications, and new countermeasures for dealing with incendiary weapons. But the strategic implications didn't end with the Japanese. The US military learned valuable lessons from their use of flamethrowers. They had proven that devastating firepower could be employed effectively in tight, confined spaces, and this concept would inform later military innovations. The use of flamethrowers would pave the way for new tactics in the fight against fortified positions, not just in the Pacific, but in future conflicts as well. The fire would remain a key element of warfare, even as new technologies emerged. In the years following the war, the moral debates surrounding the use of such weapons would persist. Were flamethrowers a necessary evil, a tool that saved lives by shortening battles and forcing the enemy to surrender? Or were they a cruel, inhumane weapon that inflicted suffering on a massive scale? The debate continues to this day, as modern warfare becomes increasingly reliant on technology that can inflict untold destruction. For the soldiers of Iwo Jima, however, the use of flamethrowers was not a matter of strategy or political debate. It was a grim reality of war. They had faced the horrors of close-quarters combat, witnessed the devastation of fire, and had done so under the unrelenting weight of battle. The war had taken its toll on both sides, but the flamethrower had made its mark, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of the changing nature of warfare in the 20th century. And for those who had lived through Iwo Jima, the image of those Japanese bunkers burning, the desperate cries of men trapped in the flames, would never leave their minds. It was the terrifying face of war in its most brutal form. The impact of flamethrowers at Iwo Jima resonated long after the final shots were fired and the island was declared secured. The weapon, which had been employed with such devastating effect, became a symbol of the intense psychological and physical toll warfare was taking on the men who fought it. But its legacy was not confined to the Marines who had wielded it, or even to the Japanese soldiers who had been its victims. It also changed the very nature of how the world understood combat in the Pacific, and later in the broader scope of global military strategy. The battle for Iwo Jima was a pivotal moment in World War II, and the use of flamethrowers had much to do with that. For the American forces, the flamethrower was an instrument of brute force, a tool to clear the enemy from their strongholds and eliminate the entrenched resistance that had so long been the hallmark of Japanese defense. However, the deeper effect of this weapon would be felt long after Iwo Jima itself was secured. As the battle raged on, the Japanese defenders faced the full force of a new kind of warfare, one that was both relentless and unforgiving. For the Japanese soldiers, many of whom had spent years fortifying the island with the belief that they would die fighting for the emperor, the sight of their sacred strongholds collapsing under the flames was a blow to their morale unlike any other. The shock was profound, as the flamethrower revealed a vulnerability they had never considered. Japanese soldiers had always been trained to defend until death, to fight with a fanatical devotion that demanded ultimate sacrifice. But flamethrowers, with their searing heat and undeniable power, forced the Japanese defenders into an existential crisis. There was no escape from the fire. No matter how deep they dug, no matter how strong their positions, they could not outlast the flames. The experience was a profound psychological defeat, a loss of both strategic and symbolic power. For many of the Japanese defenders, it was the first time they realized that their defensive methods, honed over years of preparation, had been rendered irrelevant by a weapon that did not rely on brute force but on overwhelming, concentrated firepower. The flamethrower had bypassed their most formidable defenses, and the realization that they could not hide from the fire was a crushing blow to their sense of invulnerability. It was as though the ground beneath their feet had disappeared, and the very essence of their defensive philosophy was upended. In the aftermath of Iwo Jima, the psychological effects of the battle extended far beyond the battlefield. As the war progressed and the Allies moved toward the Japanese home islands, the lessons learned on Iwo Jima would inform American strategies for future engagements. The flamethrower had proven that conventional warfare could be disrupted by new technologies, by weapons that could infiltrate the deepest defenses with terrifying ease. The use of flamethrowers during Iwo Jima was not merely a one-time tactic. It was part of a broader shift in military strategy that would define the final stages of the Pacific War. The experience on Iwo Jima taught American forces that total destruction could be achieved, not just through sheer firepower or overwhelming numbers, but through the use of specialized weapons designed to target and break down entrenched positions. The flamethrower, with its terrifying effectiveness, was an essential part of this new approach. The American military, bolstered by the success of flamethrowers in Iwo Jima, would refine their approach to urban and island warfare. The lessons learned in the heat of battle, of how to destroy bunkers, clear caves, and neutralize fortified positions, would be applied in future operations, including the invasion of Okinawa and the eventual attack on Japan's mainland. The Allies had learned that breaking the enemy's will to fight was just as important as capturing their territory. The flamethrower, in its own brutal way, became an instrument of psychological warfare that helped weaken the Japanese resolve. The legacy of flamethrowers also had a lasting impact on post-war military doctrine. As the war came to a close, the weapons used in the Pacific campaigns were analyzed and their future implications carefully considered. The flamethrower was among the technologies that would continue to influence military thinking in the years that followed. Though it was seen as a necessary tool for close-quarters combat in the Pacific, its effectiveness also opened the door for future innovations in battlefield technology, innovations that would change the way wars were fought in the decades to come. However, the moral questions surrounding the use of such weapons also lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed their destructive power. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. For the American soldiers who had wielded flamethrowers, the fear of causing such suffering was always present, despite the tactical advantages the weapon provided. The flames did not discriminate. They consumed everything in their path, including human beings. The realization that their actions had resulted in the gruesome deaths of so many soldiers, both Japanese and American, was not something that could be easily ignored. Even after the war, the veterans of Iwo Jima would carry the weight of those experiences with them. The psychological scars left by the use of flamethrowers were not easily healed. Many soldiers would later recall the intense emotions they felt as they deployed the flames, knowing that what they were doing was not just a tactical necessity, but a deep and unforgiving act of destruction. The legacy of Iwo Jima, then, was not just about the military victory that it represented. It was also about the profound moral and psychological transformation that both the soldiers and the strategists underwent as they adapted to a new era of warfare. The use of flamethrowers was emblematic of this shift, of how the rules of combat had changed, and how the line between right and wrong had blurred under the pressure of total war. In the end, the success of the flamethrower on Iwo Jima was both a triumph and a tragedy. It was a victory for the American forces, who had proven the efficacy of a new and devastating weapon. But it was also a bitter reminder of the brutality of war, of the lives lost and the horrors inflicted upon both sides. For the Japanese defenders who fell victim to the flames, the cost was immeasurable. For the Americans who wielded them, the emotional toll was profound, and in the years that followed, as the world moved into a new era of military technology and strategy, the flamethrower's legacy would endure, both as a symbol of the devastating power of fire and as a testament to the human cost of the war that had given it life. The weapon, while ultimately effective in breaking the Japanese defense on Iwo Jima, would remain a chilling reminder of how technology could be used not just to defeat the enemy, but to strip away the humanity from both sides.